Whatever happened to predictability? The milkman, the paperboy, evening TV. You miss your old familiar friends, but waiting just around the bend. Everywhere you look, everywhere there's a heart, there's a heart. I hear the hold on to. Everywhere you look, everywhere there's a love of somebody who needs you. When you're lost out there and you're all alone.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see you guys, and happy Labor Day. If you are new here, my name is John Wagler, and I am part of the team here. And so thankful that you decided to join us. Labor Day weekend, if you come to church, you're a real Christian. And so, no, just kidding. I'm just kidding. I know people are away on vacation and all that stuff. But if you are new, or if you actually are regular, I know 11 o'clock services never look like this, but we will be back to normal schedule next week. We'll be back to 8, 9:30, and 11 like we normally are. The 9:30 service this morning was slammed, but just so thankful you guys are here. We are in week number 5 of our series in 1 John, and so if you are not familiar with who John is, just a quick little summary. John is one of the closest followers of Jesus. He was in his inner circle of people. He was actually entrusted to take care of his mother, Mary, after he died and was resurrected and everything. And so John was in tight with Jesus. And then he wrote a bunch of letters. He wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then he also wrote the book of Revelation. And so John was pretty busy when it came to kind of establishing the early church and having a foundational voice in its content and in its culture. And he was one of the people that was looked to as one of the elders of the community that helped shape the narrative, what it meant to actually follow Jesus. And so when we get to this letter, here's what ends up happening. He's speaking into a community of people who they were passionately following Jesus, and they kind of got a little lazy with it. And so he begins to address some of these things, some things that have kind of infiltrated the community of beliefs. He talks a lot about obedience. He talks about that almost every single time. He talks about love in every single chapter. He talks about the essentials, the things that really matter. That's why we called it First Things First, to following Jesus. And he's pretty aggressive in all of it. Even though it's a short letter, in the first week I said it always feels like John is like tossing up this like really like candy-coated, hey, about love, and then as you're jumping for it, he's just like punching you in the gut like several times. And so that's how John kind of operates. And so he's addressing something, honestly, that is so appropriate for our culture right now, which is this idea of false narratives, false teachers, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Because right now, obviously with technology and social media, there's a lot of good, like a lot of great inventions, a lot of great advancements in technology, but then there's also a lot of bad things too, right? Because there's an element to this. Like, so for instance, in the medical field, when they're establishing something new, there's an ethics committee to kind of look at new things. In the technological world, there is no such thing. So it's just a free-for-all with like inventing things in technology. And so that's why we get a lot of good, but then that's why we get a lot of bad. And so there's one thing I want to show you like as an example of this. How many of you guys have seen or heard of like deep fake technology when they do stuff with facial? It's crazy, y'all. So I'm going to show you a little 30-second video, and you got to really pay attention to the faces. All right, so Bill Hader is being interviewed by David Letterman, and I just want you to see how every time he imitates Tom Cruise, just watch what happens to his face, and every time he imitates Seth Rogen, watch what happens to his face. I want you to see what happens in the capability of what technology can actually do.
And I go, yeah, I'm friends with Judd Apatow and Seth Rogen, and they went to your house and went, yes, they did come to my house. And I said, Seth Rogen was like, it was amazing. He has like a bike track in his backyard. It's phenomenal. And I did a Seth Rogen impression, and it was like I did a magic trick. Tom Cruise was like, yeah. Wow. And he points to me. And he pointed at me and he goes, you do impressions and you're on Saturday Night Live. And I went, hey.
Isn't that weird? Like, it's so weird that they can do that so seamlessly. And here's what this means. They can dupe any of us at any time, right? And in some capacity, just know this. At some point, because of technology, you've been duped. I know what you're thinking. No, not me. And yes, you. Like, at some point, you have watched a video that maybe wasn't what you thought it was. At some point, you have read an article that was actually written by a robot and not a person, and you thought it was factual. And so why is that such a big deal? Well, John is actually talking about this because as followers of Jesus, the same thing was happening, though very differently, clearly back then. But the same thing was starting to happen, that these false narratives, these false teachers were coming into play. And John wants to establish for the community and saying, like, hey, stop being gullible. Stop just accepting whatever you see or whatever you hear, that there's a way to begin to approach this, to actually follow Jesus correctly so it doesn't hurt you in the process. And so we're going to look at 1 John chapter 4. And as always, the line we've been using for this entire series, and this is what John's going to speak into again today, is this, that if you want to be legit, you must commit. If you want to be legit, you must commit. And so 1 John chapter 4 says this. Dear friends, do not believe everyone who claims to speak by the Spirit. You must test them to see if the Spirit they have comes from God. For there are many false prophets in the world. This is how we know if they have the Spirit of God. If a person claiming to be a prophet acknowledges that Jesus Christ came in a real body, that person has the Spirit of God. But if someone claims to be a prophet and does not acknowledge the truth about Jesus, that person is not from God. Such a person has the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard is coming into the world and indeed is already here. But you belong to God, my dear children. You have already won a victory over those people, because the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the Spirit who lives in the world. Those people belong to this world, so they speak from this world's viewpoint, and the world listens to them. But we belong to God, and those who know God listen to us. If they do not belong to God, they do not listen to us. That is how we know if someone has the spirit of truth or the spirit of deception, which he lumps into kind of this idea of the spirit of the Antichrist, right? So, and it's important kind of phrasing to just kind of hold on to as we begin to discuss it. So the first thing John wants us to do about following Jesus is to test everything. So even if you're here and you don't follow Jesus and you're trying to figure out this whole faith thing, what's good about what John is describing is he's kind of layering in, like, this is how it all begins, and this is what it means, and this is why what it means to follow Jesus. And so what John says is this, is like, you got to test everything. Not some things, but everything. Test what you believe yourself. Test what comes out of your mouth. Test what is coming in, and to continue to test everything and test everything. And now, here's why it's problematic to test everything. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of humility, because guess what? You might be wrong on something. Now, I know we don't like that, right? Like, you don't like to hear me say, like, you might be wrong, but there is, like, a reality, because think about yourself 10 to 15 years ago. Do you agree with everything you thought 10 to 15 years ago? And the answer is no. If you say yes, then you probably need to get out more. But like the answer is no, right? Like you don't. Well, here's what that means. That in 2029 to 2034, you're going to look back at 2019 and say, man, I was a little off. I was a little off on my perspective there. All right, and so why is that important? Because that means that if we can have the humility to understand that, then that means that we can be willing to test everything that is coming in. No one likes to be gullible. And so, I mean, how many guys have been duped before by something? Like you couldn't believe you believed it, right? How many guys are actually just known as being gullible? Anybody? Yeah, right? It's not like that's like a fun thing, right? It's not you're like, yes, I love being fooled, right? Like that's not like a thing. But here's what John is saying. Test everything. Test it. Like, take the time to actually test what is coming in, because guess what? There is a spirit behind everything. Now, that's critical. And when I say that, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what do you mean? Like, is it like poltergeist type stuff or whatever? No. But he's saying, like, it's a spirit. It can be a spirit of deception. It can be a spirit of manipulation. It can be a spirit of pride. It can be a spirit of power. It can be a spirit of a lot of different things. But there's a spirit behind everything that you say to inform someone else and everything that you take in from something else. Have you ever thought about that? Like, there's a spirit behind it. So John's like, hey, you got to test everything or else you're going to get duped. You're going to get deceived. You're going to get manipulated. You're going to believe a narrative that actually isn't true. And so John starts kind of creating this because he wants in their culture, he wants this. And I think as a whole, Christianity isn't good with this, but I think this is what John is actually saying, that Christianity without curiosity leads to a thoughtless community. And I think, as a whole, I believe this, as a whole, like we as Christians don't do really well with curiosity because we want to put a stake in the ground on something and just like leave it there. And we don't want to engage other perspectives. We don't want to possibly think about we might be wrong. We don't want to think that what we believe might actually hurt somebody else or whatever it is. And so we don't really want to engage that. But John's saying, no, you got to test everything. And the only way you can test everything is to actually be curious, to actually engage, to actually want to learn and actually have the perspective that, you know what, I might not have it all figured out. I mean, think about it this way. How many of you guys would deem yourself an expert in something? Look around the room. But isn't it crazy? We all talk like we are. And we think like we are, right? Like we have opinions so strong as if like we have this all on lockdown. And you cannot disagree with me. Yet we all know we're not an expert in something. Or even if you are an expert in something, you know that you don't know everything. But yet that's our mindset. Well, what is that? That's like the pride rising up in us, right? That's the spirit of pride. And so it's important for us to begin to understand that. And John is like, hey, you got to test everything that is coming out of your mouth and into your head. And so here's the first test that he says. Whenever you're kind of around people or you're hearing something from someone, you got to actually listen to what they say about Jesus. That's the first thing he says. The first test is, what do they say about Jesus? Who do they say that he is? So even when you engage conversations with people or you're reading something or whatever it is, what do they actually say about Jesus? Do they say, and this is what John says is, do they say he was here in a human body, like here present on this earth? That is a core element to Christianity. And now if you've been around church for any length of time, you might have heard this word called the gospel. And the gospel just means the good news of Jesus. And in its most simplistic form, and this is the core elements of the gospel are this, that Jesus came. He was fully man, fully human. Fully man, fully God. And he came to this earth, that he died on a cross, that he rose again for forgiveness of sin and to overcome, to show power over evil, and that one day he would right all the wrongs and all the injustices that we see in this world, that he set an example for us to live by. So we're supposed to build his kingdom here on this earth and not anyone else's, and that someday he's going to make it all right again. Those are the core elements of the gospel, okay? Now, with that, John's saying, like, if that person isn't saying those core things, then guess what? They're not from God. They're not speaking from the Spirit of God. They're not operating out of the Spirit of God in that moment, or maybe at all. So John says, you got to really pay attention. What are they actually saying about Jesus? If they say he was just a teacher, and that's it, and he taught some really good things that are really valuable, but they don't say he was also our Savior, then guess what? Then it's outside of Christianity. If they just say he was just a prophet, then it's outside of Christianity. And so in the end, here's what begins to happen. John's saying, like, hey, you got to really be careful with this and understand, test what they believe, test what they actually say about Jesus. This is like he's addressing, have you ever heard someone say, I'm spiritual but not religious? That's like the new catchphrase in culture, which is usually comes from a heart of one of two things. Either they really do love Jesus and this idea of Jesus, but they've been really burned by church. And so they don't like the idea of church and religion as a whole. And so they want to be like, no, I'm spiritual, but I just don't want to engage that part. Or the other side that it usually comes from is this idea of, I know that there's something else there, some God maybe or something, but I still want to do what I want to do. Like those are kind of the two main kind of hearts where that will come from. But here's just the reality. Christianity is a religion. You can't escape that. Like, it's a religious thought, it's a religious community. But when people are saying they don't want religion, they're saying, we don't want the legalistic rules that hurt people. But John's saying this. He's like, be really careful with all of it. Here's why. Figure out what someone actually believes about Jesus before you start taking advice from them, before you start taking it in, before you start letting them shape a narrative that you begin to believe. Because it'll show you where their base is. They'll show you what they believe is truth. Now, I think one way that to kind of process this is the reason why John is actually pushing into this so much is because he knows that if we get away from the core elements of the gospel, then eventually we make this whole thing about us rather than making it about God. And so that's why it's so important, because the second we start making something about us, right, that's when deception happens, that's when manipulation happens, that's when the whole power structures happen. And so John's like, you got to pay attention to what they actually say about Jesus and who Jesus is and was. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but Wags, are you saying that Christians can agree on the core principles, but they might disagree on other things that might be open-handed? Yes, that's what I'm saying. That there are some things, theologically, there are core elements, like Jesus, you can't really disagree with, okay, to consider yourself a Christian. Like, you can't say that he didn't die and rise again and still be a Christian. Like, you can't do that. All right, so there are core elements to believing in Jesus that are absolutely you can't get away from. However, there are some other things that are open-handed, that you might come from a different perspective on, and you have to wrestle with in community and grow together in community, because here's why. And I know this might scare some of you, and I get it, but it's okay. It just builds your curiosity. Every single person that has ever picked up a Bible to read it and engage their faith, you read it through the lens that you were raised in, the community or family structure that you were part of, maybe even the part of the country you were born in, or the denomination you went to church with or grew up with. Like, you read it through those lenses, and we all do it. Now, you might be saying, like, no, not me. I read the Bible exactly how it's meant to be read. And I would just tell you this, you don't. You don't. Like, none of us read it perfectly. We don't. We like to kind of bring our own perspective. We like to kind of bring in our own things that might have happened. Now, this is why whenever we read the Bible, we have to understand it was given to a community of people to begin to wrestle with communally together. And this is why it's so important. Because if we just read it by ourselves, and if we just discuss it to ourselves, and we just form our opinions only by ourselves, then we've only got this one tunnel vision that happens. And here's why it's important. Because you might bring something to the table around Scripture or your life experience that helps shape a part of it that maybe I never experienced. And it brings to life a whole different passage that would not have maybe resonated with me before. For instance, the Bible is written to get us to think about being exiles, to think about being the outsiders, get us to understand what it means to be pushed off and marginalized and everything. So if you were never a part of a community that's been marginalized or exiled or been enslaved or anything like that, like we can't fully understand the whole perspective until we kind of open it up to community and begin to take it in together. Like, that's a part of it. That's like how we learn and how we grow and understand God in a much bigger context. And so John is trying to get us to build our curiosity so we begin to kind of understand how the Spirit of God might be working in those moments. The second thing that he does is he begins to build, like through verse 4, he says, hey, understand your identity. You're a child of God, and kind of setting this tone there. And then in verse 5, he also kind of brings in this idea of like, why are you so offended when people who don't know Jesus don't agree with how you talk about Jesus? Like, what is it that within you that you can't handle that if someone who doesn't know Jesus or follow Jesus actually has an opinion that would take them away from Jesus? Like, why does that offend you so much? And so what John's just trying to get us to understand right there, he's like, hey, as you're going through this testing process and taking some of these things in, that's why it's so important to see where someone's coming from. Because if they're not coming from this same starting point of wanting to follow Jesus passionately and closely, then guess what? And you do, then guess what? Whatever cultural topic you start discussing, they're starting from a different point, and a different purpose, and a different understanding. And I don't care what it's about. And so they're going to start from a different point, so you're going to have a difference of opinion. And so John's like, hey, test it, and see where everyone's at. And see what the narrative is, and understand that, rather than just being like, oh, guess what? I just read this, and I'm going to let that shape my narrative. Or I just heard this. He's like, no. Pause. Test it. Read more. Study more. Figure it out. And it takes time, and it takes effort. And then he builds into a second test. As he gets into verse 6, he has a second test. He goes, take a look at who they are. So you kind of can understand what they're talking about and what they say about Jesus. And he's like, hey, look at who they are as people and what they do. Now, there's a lot of downside to social media, but there is also an upside. You get a window into people's hearts and their souls, and by what they comment on, by what they post or share, or their reaction to things, or if you go through their Twitter feed or whatever it is. You get a window into kind of where someone's coming from. I'll give you an example. I'm Bill Maher, who's got a talk show. He's had one for a long time, and he's someone who has impact over a lot of people. He helps influence and shape narratives. One of the Koch men recently died, and the reputation of that guy is some good, some bad in his life. And Bill Maher says this, and I just want you get a window into his soul a little bit. He says this in response to him dying. He says, F him. I'm glad he's dead, and hope in the end it was painful. So you pause for a second, and you're like, that says a little bit about where his heart is at. And so then you kind of take in, am I going to listen to maybe some other things? Now, is he all bad? I'm not saying he's all bad. Might he say something good here and there? He might. But you get a window into sometimes understanding, all right, who is this person really about? What are they really about? And you start You're testing everything. It's the same way, we can go through so many politicians right now, and you watch what they post or what they say about other people, and you're getting a window into their souls and their hearts. And we kind of can start understanding some of this stuff, and you can do it with celebrities, you can do it with anyone. You could do it with your friends, and you could do it with yourself. You can go back and start looking and thinking about maybe the things you've liked, or the things you've commented on, or the things you've shared. That in the end, if you're really being honest, that there was a spirit of manipulation or a spirit of power behind it, and not the spirit of truth or the spirit of God. And so John's like, you got to test this. You got to be aware. You've got to understand, hey, there's some other things going on here. In verse 6, I think it's probably the most powerful part of this section. He says, but we belong to God, and those who know God listen to us. If they do not belong to God, they do not listen to us. And so he's setting it up to kind of think about it this way. If we take spiritual advice from someone who doesn't know Jesus, you will eventually be deceived. And so what John's saying here is you got to test everything, because, listen, that person might say something that's true, and that might work for that little thing. But if you keep staying there and they don't believe in Jesus or they don't follow Jesus, eventually they're going to deceive you or manipulate you or point you away from Jesus. And so he's like, who are they? What do they believe? How do they talk? What do they think about Jesus? You have to test it and see. It's an incredibly important thing that I think we just don't think about sometimes. Now, you might be thinking well, Wags, aren't there some common truths among belief systems and everything else? And I would say, yes, there are some truths intersect and are woven in together across all belief systems. And even the idea of everyone knows being generous is a good thing. And so that's woven into a bunch of belief systems. Even there are a lot of atheists who are very generous people and stuff like that. So there is this element of yes, there are some truths that kind of go over all belief systems, but at some point you have to get to the main thing. Because that main thing creates the main purpose of why they're saying what they're saying. So when someone says, hey, all religions believe the same thing or end up in the same place, I'm like, not if you actually study them. They believe very different things. Very different. All roads point to the same place. No, they don't. It's actually completely different highways. They might like have like an on-ramp here and there that kind of cross over, but they get on different highways. And so it's important to understand that. And so John's like talking about, hey, there's these false prophets, these false teachers. They're going to try and get you. They're going to try and manipulate you. They're going to try and do this. And it's going to be subtle sometimes, but it's going to be intentional. And here's the other part to this. He wants everyone to understand that this idea of sharing your faith and talking about your faith and how you're trying to shape spiritual advice with anyone else, he's trying to understand this, that you too could be a false prophet if you aren't careful. You too could lead someone down the wrong path if you aren't careful. You too, if you're not testing the things that you're saying, could lead someone in the wrong direction. Joe Miller, who's our executive pastor, and Laura, who was playing keys here today, their daughter Sydney, one of their daughters, Sydney, asked me a couple weeks ago before I was getting up to preach. She said, hey, do you get nervous when you get up to preach? And I just said, yes. Anytime I speak at church or anytime I'm sharing like anything around the Bible, my heart will race right before I get up on stage, and it kind of calms down after that. But every time, like if you see me standing over there, just know like my heart's just going like, like this every single time. Now, why is that? Well, in James, so the brother of Jesus, this guy named James, he wrote a letter as well. It's in the Bible, and he said this, that anyone who teaches is held more accountable. And there's this weight that I carry every Sunday I get up here and speak. And there's this weight that I feel every time I prep. There's this weight that I feel anything I write down in my notes, or any little line that I think would be like, oh, that's tweetable or quotable or whatever. Like there's like something there, there's this weight that I feel around every single thing. And every time I pray, like whether it's Sunday mornings when I do a quick little run through like in the office, and I spend several minutes back there praying, like one of the things I pray, I was like, God, if I say anything, because I know I'm not perfect and I can get in some of this stuff, and I was like, if I say anything like that is outside of what you want me to say, will you like, I don't use this term, but I was like, will you just Men in Black everybody and like just make it go away, right? That's how I kind of like think about it like in those moments. And the reason is because I don't want to ever become desensitized to the weight of what this is. So that's why like I don't regurgitate any sermons. Like I start from scratch every single week. So even if I've talked on a topic from before, I start back over and kind of work my way through. Why? Because I want to be like kind of genuine, just kind of be like, all right, God, what do you want me to say this time? Say this go around to everybody. And sometimes some things overlap, sure, but the point is like there's this weight, but here's what this also means. Like if you're leading a Bible study, you're carrying this weight. If you're leading a small group, you're carrying this weight. If you're sitting down with friends and you're kind of looked at as like you're leading people and shaping any kind of development of their faith, like you are carrying this weight. And so John's like, just know that. It's a big deal. So test it all. Test everything that's coming out and then what's coming in. And then so how do we test? I just want to give you 4 quick things. So how do I test things? Study. That's the first way. It's like, I said this in the first service, that if you were to ask my family about the fact that I said telling someone to study is very humorous. I didn't even buy a book in college. But like but now that's all I do is study. And so, but studying was like something that's like, I do a lot of now. I feel like I made up for the first 25 years of my life in the last 17. But like there's just a reality that we've got to study and we've got to learn. You can't get away from that. That's how you test. The second thing is to be in community. You got to be in community with other people. Like if you're just kind of, if you're not in community with people who don't think like you and maybe have different experiences, if you aren't in community with people like that, then you just get tunnel vision on who Jesus is. The third thing is to seek wise counsel. Seek wise counsel. The people that you want to go talk to that have wisdom, the people that hear from God the most and are the ones that try to. I know you're like, what? Right? No, but the people around you that you're seeking counsel from, you should like ask them like, hey, how often have you prayed this week? And if they're like, it's been a little while, then I'd be like, maybe you should talk to somebody else. Why? Because the people that you want to talk to are the people who are like, hey, are you like really seeking after God in your life? And I want some wise counsel around my spiritual stuff. And I feel like, how do I handle my finances? Maybe a financial advisor would do well there. Okay, but like I'm talking about like how do we kind of like, understand the spiritual components of this. And the fourth one is tune out the distractions, which is near impossible, but you got to work at it. So John then kind of takes them there, and he leads into this, and this is quick. I'll close out with this. In verse 11, he says, "Dear friends, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love each other. No one has ever seen God, but if we love each other, God lives in us, and his love is brought to full expression in us. And God has given us his Spirit as proof that we live in him and he in us. Furthermore, we have seen with our own eyes and now testify that the Father sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. All who declare that Jesus is the Son of God have God living in them, and they live in God." So again, he's like, what do you say about Jesus? What are you actually saying? Because it shows like whether or not you love God or not. And then he says, "We know how much God loves us, and we have put our trust in his love. God is love, and all who live in him live in God, and God lives in them. And as we live in God, our love grows more perfect, so we may not be afraid on the day of judgment, but we can face him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. Such love has no fear, because perfect love expels all fear. And if we are afraid, it is for fear of punishment, and this shows that we have not fully experienced his perfect love. We love each other because he loved us first." Now you might be thinking like, my gosh, we've talked about love so much in this series. And I would say yes, because John mentions it every single chapter. Carlos spoke on it extensively last week. But the reason is because we forget how to love very quickly. For instance, Carlos did a wonderful job last week talking about love. And in the span of Sunday to this Sunday, my gut feeling is we didn't love as well as we should have at some point. We forget about it. So we always have to be reminded of the simplicity of loving others. We have to be reminded and be convicted of maybe the ways that we aren't loving people like we should. And that love at the crux of following Jesus is love. You cannot escape it. And even when we think about like love transcends everything. Love transcends race. Love transcends economic class. Love transcends laws of the land. Love transcends everything. I'll give you an example of this. It doesn't matter where you fall on the or the immigration or refugee debate. It really doesn't to me. Like you might have like your own views on what the laws should be and all that stuff. That is totally cool by me. But if you take love out of it, that's a problem. For instance, when we see like the inhumanity that's been happening with the children in cages, and like even recently I was reading something how there were some of the teenage girls that were having their menstrual cycles, and like they had no tampons to deal with anything, and so they just have like bloody pants, and so like the way that some people are being treated as like inhumane as young kids, and so I would just say this: if our language on the front end is, well, maybe their parents shouldn't have broken the law, then I would say that you have taken love out of it. You've taken love completely out of how you're viewing the process on how to treat and love people, and you're more concerned about law. And so God's love transcends law. So there are going to be times where, because we want to love other people, that it'll probably be in disagreement of the law of the land. I was reading the early church father, early church writer, and he said this, that sometimes being a good follower of Jesus means being a bad Roman citizen. That's what he said. Because there were some laws of the land that didn't love people correctly. And so he said, so sometimes your law transcends the love. Your love transcends the law. And so John is saying the same exact thing. He's like, our love has to transcend everything. We have to love everyone. And that's super hard to do. But he says if we want to follow Jesus like we should, then that's what should happen. So if we can't buy into that as a Christian, then the truth is we can't fully buy into Jesus then. If we can't buy into this idea of always thinking about love and talking about love and being convicted by, am I loving like I should, then really we can't fully kind of convince ourselves to follow Jesus like we should. And so John kind of puts it out there. Again, his words, not mine, just saying like, if you love, you're following Jesus. If you don't, you're not. That's what he says. And so he kind of makes it this way. And so I wanted you to read something with me, because I feel like sometimes when we read things together, it adds more weight to it. So on the count of three, I just want you to read this. You ready? 1, 2, 3. When I choose to not love others, I am showing that I may not know Jesus. So all of a sudden, when we put words to something and we say, I would like to choose hatred over a person or something, and I'm choosing not to love others, and maybe I'm revealing I actually don't even know Jesus. I'm sure revealing I'm not even following him right now in this moment. We had a powerful thing happen in the first service that as I was just like walking through the hallway, we have prayer all the time after the service, and I just thought this was the most beautiful thing, or one of the most beautiful things that's happened in our church here recently. And someone after the first service came up in tears because they just said, I just realized I have so much hatred for our president, and I'm just deeply convicted by it, and I hate that I have that hate in my heart. And this person just said, I realized that, like, that's not following Jesus. That's revealing another kind of spirit within me. And so, this idea of love is a big thing, and it's a hard thing. But that's what you're called to do as a Christian. That's what we're called to do if we want to follow Jesus, like he tells us to. But the thing that interrupts that is this idea of the spirit of pride. There's a spirit of truth which leads us to Jesus, and leads us to truth, and leads us to the things that are of Jesus. And then there's the spirit of pride. And so here's how you kind of know. I could have written down about 15, but I wanted to highlight 3 that I think are important for us to just kind of take in together. When the spirit of pride is talking louder than the spirit of truth, we lack love, wisdom, and would rather find authority in man. We would rather let culture disciple us than Jesus. Or we'd rather do whatever we want than obey what Jesus taught. When the spirit of pride is talking louder than the spirit of truth, we shape the Bible instead of letting it shape us. We like to make the Bible say something that kind of makes us feel good, or allows us to do what we want, or think what we want, or treat people how we want, rather than the reverse of letting the Bible interpret us. And the last one is this: when the spirit of pride is talking louder than the spirit of truth, we are more known for our criticism than our grace. You see, right now we live in a world where everything's fear-based. That's why I love this last part where John talks about how perfect love casts out all fear. And here's what we know about relationships built on fear: they will always end up in some kind of abuse. And so we see this kind of, what happens like politically in our country right now, and it happens like in all countries actually right now. And it's this idea of fear-based kind of mindset and methodology. And so what John says is, if you want to overcome the fear-based methodology, or if you want to overcome fear in your own personal relationships or anything like that, then the only way to do it is actually start loving people like you should. See, when you start loving one another like we should, then what ends up happening is, if you are someone who likes to put fear in people, you realize you can't. That's not a thing love does. If you are someone who you're fearful of maybe the differences that you might have with somebody else, when you love them and you love one another, then all of a sudden you get with them, and then that love kind of overcomes the fear. And so it pushes out the fear. It's one of the reasons Matt and I do this podcast, like the Stay Curious podcast. It's like we want to keep bringing up things that are like, hey, there's a large perspective here. There's a lot of things going on here in this world. We don't know everything, and that's okay. And we want to kind of push out the fear so we can actually begin to love each other like we should. That can actually begin to happen. And I would just say this: when I wrote this line down for our church, and that's as I was praying this week, and because in the heart of it, for our community, I just want us to kind of let this sink in, that a church that isn't consumed by the message of loving others also isn't consumed with following Jesus. And so for us, I want our church, the heart of our church to I want our hearts to go pop, 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 pop. When we think about loving others, when we think about being generous, when we think about sacrificing, when we think about being selfless, when we think about all these things that represent the cross in the life of Jesus, and what it actually means, I want our hearts to beat. There's something that stirs up inside of us. It's like, my God, we get to do this. This is crazy. And so the 2 of the greatest questions you can ask yourself are this: No matter any discussion or any opinion or whatever, it's, does this make me more like Jesus, and how does this make me love others more? If we lived that way, man, our lives would look a lot different. We would perceive people a lot differently. And a lot of things would begin to change. And so here, if you're new here with us, we do 2 minutes to think at the end of every sermon, which is a way for us to just kind of take in what God might be speaking into our hearts. And so we just ask you to answer the questions, and whether on your phone or if you take notes by hand, you can do that. So here are the 2 minutes to think questions. Where's an area of your life where the spirit of pride is speaking louder than the spirit of truth? Number 2, how would people describe your selfless and sacrificial love towards them? And number 3, what is one thing you can do to learn more about Jesus and more selfless? So we'll put 2 minutes up there, and then after that's done, I will come back up and close us in prayer. Will you guys pray with me? So God, this morning, my prayer for all of us is that we would take a step back for a second. No matter what stage of this whole faith thing we're at, like just figuring it out, or maybe we're new to it, or maybe we're seasoned, whatever it is. That we take a step back for a second and really take in, do I really test everything? What's really shaping me? Do the decisions I'm making make me more like you? Like, that we start taking in some of these things, God, to begin to see and have an honest awareness of where we really are, how we really think, and maybe what's really stirring in our own souls. God, I pray for anyone in this room that might be trying to figure out if they want to follow you or say yes to following you. And as they begin to think about what they want their life to be and their purpose to have, and God, my hope is that they would find that in you and say yes to you. And for others in this room that maybe have been following Jesus for any length of time, really, but you call yourself a Christian, that there would be a deep sense of conviction over us about truly loving others, and a deep sense of conviction about being curious so that we can be more thoughtful in how we interact with each other, and how we learn more from you, and how we engage the world around us. So God, we just thank you for the work you've been doing in this series in us, and just the fact that something that was written 2,000 years ago is so applicable to today. Just so thankful for that. In your name we pray, everybody said. Amen. Hey, before you guys get out of here, a couple quick things. If you would like prayer for anything, we always have folks over here ready to pray. I don't care if you want a miracle in your life, or you're praying for your job, or you just want a prayer just about anything. Please go over and see them. They would love to pray with you. If you want anything practical, next steps of your faith, you can stop by the lounge area. There are people out there as well. If you want to get connected here, just stop by the lounge area. There's folks out there to help you do that. We also have bumper stickers for you guys. I forgot to announce that in the first service, but we got these new bumper stickers. If you're someone who puts bumper stickers on your cars, we got some really nice ones to put on there. And they're like good, like thoughtful things for people to read as they're tailgating you. And so, so there's that. The other thing is, I just want to say thank you. We don't have our partner spotlight this Sunday. We'll be back at it with that next Sunday. But just thank you so much for your generosity. I know we say this every week. So whether or not you give online or you give in the share boxes, it's crazy like what started to happen in our community. In 2 weeks, we're going to celebrate our 5th birthday, which is really exciting. If you guys have been here for any of our birthday celebrations, I always say this: if you can make it through one of our birthday celebrations and not leave our church, you're one of our people. And so we just like to have a good time. And so, but we're about to celebrate 5 years, and it's been really cool to see what God's been doing over these 5 years, and the opportunities that we've had because of your generosity to have these great partnerships and some new things that are developing. We've talked about the foster care stuff that we're getting involved in, all the partner spotlights that you'll begin to see on a regular basis that we're continuing on with. And then some of you guys know this, some of you guys don't, but we are also in talks about building a child development center here as well, and then partnering with some other ways, and there's a bunch of stuff going on as a way to reach into the community, and which would be a really cool opportunity for us. And that only happens because you guys are incredibly generous. And is the development center going to take money? Yeah, it's not going to, hey, there's a development center. But it's going to take money to do and everything else, but we have this really cool opportunity to develop something here in this community, and that's going to reach a lot of families. And then we've got some big dreams for it to take those development centers into other areas of Richmond as well. And so really excited about that. So again, just thank you for your hearts to want to reach the community. You guys have a great rest of your Sunday, and we will see you all next week.